Hello, this is our group project for the Nanking Massacre for History 1112. We have decided to present our project using Google Slides and Audacity to record a narrative. Our presentation will cover an introduction about the massacre, followed by Japan's interest, relations between China and Japan, Japanese culture in genocide, Battle of Shanghai, the Nanking Massacre, the Western response and Japanese repercussion, and finally, our conclusion. Our outline includes myself, Christopher Boniface, followed by Lauren with 2 body slides, Claire with 2 body slides, and Osama with a slide and a conclusion. Moving forward to slide 3. The Nanking Massacre started after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where Japanese soldiers were attempting to rescue a missing soldier behind Chinese enemy lines. Japan's forces also tried a diplomatic approach after having failed at a mission to retrieve the soldier, but the Chinese refused. This further caused tension between Japan and China during this time. This eventually led to the Second Sino-Japanese War, also known as the Nanking Massacre. And this will lead us into our next slide. What was Japan's interest in China in the first place? It started with the First Sino-Japanese War, where Japan and China fought over the Asian peninsula known as Joseon, also known as modern-day Korea. They were interested in the resources that Japan needed for their expansion, and China was also intrigued and wanted to have the resources in Joseon, which was iron and other goods. Japan's first intake and adaptation of European culture through the Meiji Restoration allowed for nationalism to fuel their expansion, further analyzing their nationalist pride, which caused several more wars and eventually led to World War II. Thank you.
The Nanking Safety Zone. It was a safe place set up right in the city of Nanking for victims to go after the massacre. It was a refugee camp, and the camp was about 3.5 square miles long. It housed approximately 200,000 to 250,000 refugees. It was run by 22 foreigners living in China who did not flee when they saw the Japanese invaded. Below the picture is members of the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. The effects, more specifically, the long-term effects. After all the justifiable actions against those responsible for the Nanking Massacre, many Chinese citizens still have a strong sense of mistrust and hatred towards Japan and their many war crimes against them. Their feelings for Japan is fueled by the fact that they're unwillingly to admit and apologize for their actions against China. Despite many personal views, the memory of Nanking had made Japan and China's Sino-Japanese relations and bilateral relations, more specifically political, economical, and cultural relations, increase since the 70s. Trade, education, and culture have boosted for them, both making China a very important trade partner.
The rape of Nanking was immediately preceded by the Battle of Shanghai, and this occurred in the summer of 1937, right before the rape of Nanking was occurred. So Japan had expected an easy victory over the Chinese and that they would be able to conquer all of China in just 3 months, but China surprised them by putting up a very large fight, and they had a tough resistance, destroying the timetable that Japan had set and made them upset by not sticking to it. Victory was finally declared by the Japanese in November of 1939, a month before the rape of Nanking occurred, and the Japanese were set on revenge. They were very upset that the Chinese had put up such a tough fight and that they proved so hard to conquer. So they decided to try and make the next battle as humiliating as possible and as degrading as possible in order to prove their point to Japan and prove their superiority. So the actual Nanking Massacre, troops barged in on December 13th, 1937, and they were given specific orders to kill all captives and inflict as much pain as possible. Around 900 or 90,000 Chinese soldiers were waiting for them, and they were taken as either prisoners of war or killed on sight. And even if they were taken as prisoners of war, they were ultimately either shot, beheaded by the soldiers, or burned alive just as a form of punishment. And so after Japanese soldiers had taken care of the Chinese soldiers, the soldiers moved on to the women, and this is where the rape of Nanking actually comes from. No age was protected, and between 20 to 80,000 women were gang raped and murdered or left. If they weren't murdered, they were left otherwise mutilated and debilitated permanently, and so they had permanent scars from this. And so civilians in crowds were shot at random. Shop owners were locked in their shops and they would set the shops on fire, burning them alive. Or they were just randomly decapitated. And so this ultimately lasted until February 1938, where the intensity of the violence stopped, but people were still forced into a number of other things. A lot were made to be heroin addicts, and women were forced to be comfort women, which were basically sex slaves for the Japanese army and were there for whatever they pleased.
After the devastating attack of Nanking City, a small group of Western businessmen and missionaries and the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone set up a neutral area for refugees for Nanking citizens. This was opened in 1937 and constituted a number of refugee camps. However, on December 1st, 1937, Chinese government abandoned Nanking, leaving it under control of the International Committee. The trial of Nanking atrocities was one of the ways in which Japan faced repercussions for its role in the massacre. A number of individuals that were involved in the atrocities were tried, including government officials and military leaders that indicted it for Class A war crimes and others that were charged for Class B and C war crimes by allied nations in places such as Nanjing, Manila, Batavia, Rabaul, Singapore, and Yokohama. However, in conclusion, these horrific events of the rape of Nanking were roughly about 80,000 women. 80,000 women were sexually assaulted and represents of the most horrendous events of the Sino-Japanese War. Japan's interest for control of the Korean peninsula precipitated into wars against other Asian countries, such as China, which ended in the massacre at Nanking. The atrocities of Nanking were preceded in the Battle of Shanghai, which, despite some resistance, Japan overpowered the Chinese army. Such events defined the Sino-Japan relations, which up to date are tainted with mistrust and mischief. Despite the restoration of Nanking City and the trial of the involved individuals, Japan has never publicly accepted its responsibility in the 1937 massacre, which has been one of the derailing factors towards the restoration of close relations between the two countries.